Chapter 1. Herstory. To understand what happens now, one must find the cause, which may be very long ago in its beginning, but is surely there. Pearl Buck. We can only understand what happens to women during the childbirth rite of passage by understanding birth culture and its historical roots. This chapter begins to warp the loom with the yarns that subsequent chapters will be woven through. It provides a brief overview of the herstory of women and birth, highlighting key elements that form the origins of modern Western birth culture. These yarns primarily originated in Europe and were exported across the globe through centuries of invasion and colonization. Many aspects of the herstory introduced in this chapter will be revisited through this book as we explore modern ideas and practice. Our knowledge about the past is based on the interpretation of evidence left by our ancestors. Until recently, those with the authority to interpret the evidence and record the past have primarily been white, wealthy men. Therefore, the focus has been on a his story, that foregrounds men and their contributions to the world. In writing this chapter, I have drawn on the work of academics interpreting the past from a female perspective. In particular, I share aspects of herstory that are reflected in birth culture and maternity services today. This herstory also reflects some of our deeply rooted feelings and fears about womanhood and childbirth. There is increasing evidence that memories and fears can be passed through generations. Our ancestral red thread is our connection to herstory through our maternal bloodline. We are the ancestors of the women who lived through herstory and who survived by any means necessary: acceptance, silence, collusion, and, in some cases, resistance. Our red thread may partly explain why women find it so difficult to resist and speak out against their oppression. We know in our bodies and souls what happened to those who went before us. This pattern of mistrust, fear, and silence has compromised the very telling of herstory and hindered our ability to learn from the past and change the future. Woman as creatrix. Every human living today descended from a single woman who lived in Africa around 200,000 years ago. This woman, named mitochondrial Eve by scientists, was the first to give birth to daughters who transmitted mitochondrial DNA to their children. Mitochondrial DNA is contained in the gametes, reproductive cells of both men and women. However, male mitochondrial DNA is in the tail of the sperm and is lost or destroyed during the fertilization process. Female mitochondrial DNA remains protected in the ovum and is passed into the growing fetus. Therefore, mitochondrial DNA is the genetic element of the red thread that binds women through their maternal lineage back to mitochondrial Eve and each other. Early humans revered the capacity of women to create, birth, and sustain life through their bodies. It would have made sense that any divine entity responsible for giving and sustaining life would be female. Depictions of fecund female forms dominate artifacts from around 30,000 BCE to 10,000 BCE. Early humans carved vulvas on cave walls and sculpted images of female figures such as the goddess of Willendorf, Lucelle, and Kostenki. In cave art depicting birth, the figure giving birth is much larger than the figure surrounding her. Whether these works depict a great mother goddess or a human birth, the central and dominant figure is the birthing female, with those around her secondary. Humans lived in matricentric societies that privileged the sustainability and well-being of the tribe. The term matricentric means centered on the mother and the raising of children, rather than matriarchal, which means ruled by the mother. Some tribes remained nomadic, while others built shelters and settled on land. Women were primarily responsible for gathering food, but also participated in hunting. Although women were considered the creators of children, they were not solely responsible for the care of them. Instead, the tribe shared the responsibility of raising younger members of the community. In particular, men and elders would care for mobile children while women gathered food, carrying their breastfeeding babies. Food sources were dependent on the life cycles of animals and seasons. Humans needed to work with nature to survive. Cave paintings suggest that people had a mystical connection to the animals they hunted. For example, a cave painting in Tassili in the Sahara, 10,000 BC to 8,000 BC, shows a male figure stalking an animal. The artist has drawn a line connecting the man to the womb of the female figure outside the hunting scene. She appears to be in a shamanic trance. Female shamans and priestesses were often portrayed with animals or wearing ritual animal costumes. Goddesses were also depicted alongside animals or as part animal. Animals associated with fertility, such as the cow, and transformation, such as the snake, were commonly drawn. The serpent was associated with goddesses across the ancient world, for example, Gaia, Nehushta, Saraparagine, and Ayasayaset. Snakes periodically shed their skin to emerge renewed, mirroring the cycle of nature, including menstruation, and symbolizing rebirth. The cycles of the female body and how these cycles embody nature was also well understood by our ancestors. Symbols of nature were used to portray the connection of the female body, menstrual cycle, gestation and birth, with nature, in particular the lunar cycle. For example, the Venus of Lascelles was carved into the entrance of a cave in southern France around 25,000 BCE to 20,000 BCE. She has large breasts and hips and rests one hand over her womb. In her other hand, she holds a bison's horn shaped like a crescent moon and marked with 13 lines. The number of lines is likely to represent the lunar cycle and the menstrual cycle. There are 13 new moons in a solar year, and women have 13 menstrual cycles in a year. There are also 13 days in the lunar cycle from new moon to full moon, and 13 days in the menstrual cycle from bleed to ovulation. 13 became the goddess's sacred number, and later Friday became the day of the goddess Freya. Notably, in today's patriarchal culture, Friday the 13th is considered unlucky. Early women's understanding of their cycle also allowed them to use tools to track their bodies. They scored lines into battens, often decorated with vulvas, to count their menstrual cycle and to measure the length of pregnancies. Pregnancies last 10 lunar months, and counting the number of moon cycles provides an estimation of when birth will occur. The development of agriculture around 9,500 BCE reinforced the worship of the goddess, and her symbol of the moon became increasingly important. Planting crops was timed around the moon phases, and the success of crops relied on forces outside of human control. Although interpretations of the goddess varied across cultures, they shared many similarities and associations. She often had several coexisting faces that reflected the cycles of nature and human life. She was the giver of life, the wielder of death, and the regeneratrix. In some cases, she was the mother, maiden, and crone. Ownership and war. Agricultural communities began to develop approximately 10,000 years ago. Agriculture changed the way humans lived and contributed to the replacement of matricentric societies with patriarchal societies. Families owned land and required children to provide labour for farming. The ownership of land was passed down through the paternal line from father to son. Therefore, it became necessary for men to guarantee the paternity of their children, requiring the ownership of women and the control of their reproduction. Women were perceived as reproductive assets that could be bought with a dowry, bride price, from their father by their husband. Unlike in earlier hunter-gatherer times, children were no longer the responsibility of the tribe. Instead, women became the primary carers of their older children in addition to their babies. This created and reinforced the concept that women are naturally predisposed to care for children and confined them to the role of care provider for the family. However, during the early rise of patriarchy, women retained control over childbirth, and it remained a female-only domain. They continued to revere the goddesses who granted them fertility and protected them in childbirth. As the primary carers for their families, women developed extensive knowledge about remedies and the management of injuries. This included using herbs for fertility, contraception, abortion, and labour pain. The ownership of land and food supplies also resulted in social stratification based on wealth. Men who owned more land and wealth had a higher status than those who were poor. The previous leaders, men and women, who ruled by consensus, were replaced with dictators, and these new kings passed on their wealth and power to their sons. Humans with the least wealth and status became slaves to those in power. Women who were married to wealthy men had a higher status than those who married poor. However, regardless of the larger hierarchy, women had a lower status than men in each layer of stratification. For example, a slave man had higher status than a slave woman. Unsurprisingly, These social changes did not occur in nomadic tribes until many years later, and women continued to hold leadership roles within groups who roamed the land rather than owned it. Disputes over land, ongoing invasions, and war further reinforced patriarchy. Sometime after 1700 BCE, Indo-European tribes from Northern Europe and Central Asia invaded Western Europe with horses and weapons. Kings needed to mobilize their people to fight these invasions and protect their lands. It was primarily men who went into battle and died in huge numbers, creating increased pressure on women to produce sons to replace those lost. War spread across North Africa, and Egypt became militaristic, forcing men into the army and enslaving the women and children they captured during invasions. Fertile women's capacity to reproduce made them a valuable resource, and they were raped by their captors and kept under surveillance to ensure the paternity of resulting children. These widespread abuses are reflected in the founding myths of later societies, such as Roman, that frequently include the rape of women. Religion and state. Religions reflect and serve the culture from which they emerge. The evolution of deities during the rise of patriarchy reflected the social and cultural changes that occurred. The ancient female fertility deities evolved and incorporated war and politics. For example, the ancient Mesopotamian goddess Inanna, Ishtar, was the goddess of fertility, sex, and war. Male gods of war also appeared alongside the females. For example, in Egypt, Mahis, lion-headed god of war, joined Menhet, she who massacres. These new gods were transcendent, above nature, and controlled events on earth. Men had domination over nature, animals, and women. The gods had domination over man. Goddesses also evolved, but often retained their earlier associations with animals, the moon, fertility, and childbirth. For example, Greek Artemis, who later became the Roman Diana, was the goddess of the hunt and the moon. She was the patroness of nurturing fertility and birth, and was depicted wearing a crescent moon headdress along with her bow and arrows. Eventually, the many gods and goddesses evolved into the one father god of the three monotheistic Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. These religions placed humans above nature and God above humans, and advocated that humans aim to transcend their connection to nature to be closer to God. Women's reproductive bodily functions, once revered, were now evidence that they were bound to nature and therefore impure. Menstruation and childbirth were believed to be contaminating, requiring isolation during and purification afterwards. Female sexuality was further evidence that women were unable to control their natural bodily urges. Women were excluded from participating in religious rites and forbidden to worship any deity other than the one Father God. All three religions claimed that the subordination of women by men was sanctioned by God and that man should have domination over nature. States require the organisation of political community, a nation or territory under one government. The first states formed approximately 5,000 years ago in Sumer, now southern Iraq, Egypt and China. The development of laws within these states was influenced by the patriarchal social structures and religious ideologies of the time. Laws relating to women's reproduction were similar across states and made adultery, contraception and abortion criminal offences. Middle Assyrian laws, 1300 BCE, developed out of the previous Mesopotamian treatment of women as the property of men. In Assyria, women were not considered sentient beings, and half of the laws created were specific to women. For example, it was a criminal offence for a woman to commit adultery because her husband owned her body and needed to guarantee that her children were his. Women who performed abortions on themselves or others received the most severe punishment. They were impaled and denied burial. The punishment was not based on concerns about the life of the unborn child. Indeed, infanticide was fairly common and was legal if carried out by the father of the child. However, a woman aborting her baby was a crime against the man who legally owned her body and the unborn child. As states developed, women across the globe, including Assyria, China, Greece and India, were prohibited from leaving their house alone, either by law or custom. Laws were enacted to regulate women's freedom of movement and in some cases required them to cover their body in the presence of men. Again, this was important because the female body was the property of the husband or father. In societies where men were not only physically stronger but also had a moral authority, women were at risk of rape. This situation was exacerbated by the fact that women no longer had the right to control their reproduction through contraception or abortion. Women were effectively limited to the domestic sphere and required to focus on meeting the needs of their families. In this role, women became experienced in the use of herbs and remedies for managing the health of themselves and their families. In keeping with the preceding Herstory, childbirth remained an exclusively female event. Although laws sought to control sex contraception and abortion, women maintained control of childbirth. They gave birth in their homes, hidden from the male gaze and cared for by female relatives and friends. Midwives, who were invariably women, were particularly skilled in assisting with childbirth and were called upon for their knowledge of remedies for labour pain and their ability to manage complications. During the early Middle Ages, Christianity spread into Europe and churchmen attempted to dissuade the regional ethnic cultures from their worship of the goddesses and nature. European women spent many hours spinning wool and weaving cloth. Therefore, European goddesses were often depicted as spinners and weavers of fate, holding distaffs, spindles that hold wool for spinning. Women would invoke these goddesses through song and incantation as they spun and wove together. The church was concerned about these female spiritual practices, and bishops argued that women gathering in their webs and doing woolen work was associated with magical practices. However, this condemnation did not prevent women from continuing to revere their goddesses. The triple goddess, Mother Maiden Crone of earlier times, was reflected in the three sisters who were believed to attend births to spin the fate of the baby. Women would leave offerings of food for the sisters to ensure a good fate for the baby, despite the church condemning this practice. Throughout the Middle Ages, Europeans resisted the monotheistic religion advocated by the Christian Church. To win them over, churchmen altered the established mythologies and deities to align with Christianity. For example, depictions of the nurturing Earth Mother with a snake transformation at her breast became the sexualized image of luxuria, lust, a female temptress. The Saxon goddess Istra, or Ostara, and her sacred moon hair became the basis for Easter. Hathor Astarte was an earlier Egyptian version of the same goddess who was believed to have laid the golden egg of the sun. This goddess mythology is the reason that Christian celebrations of Easter include rabbits and eggs. Furthermore, the Catholic Church recognised the people's need for a mother deity and offered Mother Mary as a replacement for the traditional goddesses. Mary provided the perfect role model for Catholic women because she was pure, chaste, and a martyr to her child. Catholics also believed that the unborn baby's soul would go to hell if the baby died before being baptised. Therefore, the life of the unbaptised baby took precedence over the baptised mother during pregnancy and birth. The notion of the martyr mother remains at the core of modern mothering ideology and maternity services. In English translations of the Bible, women's sorrow or pain in labour was a punishment from God for going against his command. Eve was persuaded by the snake to eat the fruit, knowledge, from the tree of good and evil. She then encouraged Adam to do the same. In punishment for this transgression, God told Eve, "I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy conception. In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children, and thy desire shall be to thy husband, and he shall rule over thee." Genesis 3:16. Catholic women were advised to gain strength from Mary and St. Margaret to assist them in childbirth. In contrast, the Protestant Church did not offer comfort from female deities during labour. Instead, women were told to groan and sigh to the Lord. Luther himself said, "Let them, women, bear children until they are dead of it. That is what they are for." Wise women and medicine men. Throughout the Middle Ages, women continued to take responsibility for the domestic duties required to run their homes and raise their children. Depending on their class, they either carried out the necessary tasks themselves or paid other women to undertake domestic work. Women used folk medicine to care for sick family members and to manage their reproductive health. Folk medicine refers to the use of traditional remedies and was learned by observation and experience rather than formal education. Some women were particularly skilled in these practices and provided services for the community as healers and midwives. These wise women provided holistic care that included herbal remedies, chants, invocations, and charms. Wise women held status within their communities and could trade their services for money and goods. Some women also worked in the male-dominated healthcare professions, such as apothecaries and barber surgeons. During the Middle Ages, in addition to cutting hair, barber surgeons performed a range of surgical procedures, such as bloodletting, tooth extraction, and even amputations. Women were usually involved in these professions because their fathers or husbands were. Since the 12th century, universities had been appearing throughout Europe offering higher education to wealthy men. The curriculum was based on the tradition of knowledge that emerged from early Greek philosophers such as Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Teachings rejected what was considered subjective ancient wisdom, favouring science and rationality. It was believed that nature could be understood best through intellectual analysis. Universities also reinforced religious and cultural ideas about the inferiority of women. However, they used science and claims of rationality rather than religious doctrine. They leaned heavily on Aristotle's description of women as inferior passive species who were merely deformed men. It was in this belief system that men began to formally study medicine and become physicians. Male physicians were supported by the church and state, enabling them to position themselves as the only legitimate medical practitioners. Royal religious and academic decrees restricted the practice of medicine to licensed physicians only. A license could only be obtained after completing a university education to gain a formal qualification, then undertaking a clerical vow. Women were unable to access university education and were ineligible to take clerical vows. Male physicians also persuaded the English Parliament and King Henry to legislate that no woman was to use the practice of physic, thereby effectively banning women from practicing medicine and surgery. Unlicensed practitioners, including women, were permitted to provide healthcare within a limited scope, for example, dealing with minor problems such as boils. They were only allowed to charge small fees and were prohibited from advertising. Midwifery was not considered medical practice, and wise women continued to provide midwifery services without restriction. Despite attempts by male physicians to eradicate female healers, wise women maintained respect and status within their communities. People continued to engage their services because their cures were effective and their fees were affordable. In response, male physicians set about defaming wise women and their services. They accused them of contravening church law because they provided women with contraceptives, abortions, and herbs to ease labour pain. The church maintained that healing without a licence was heresy, and if a woman dare to cure without having studied, she is a witch and must die. Therefore, male physicians claimed that wise women were practicing witchcraft. They also blamed sorcery when their university-learned medicine failed to cure ailments. An early Latin translation for the ancient English word witch is wise woman. The oldest usage of the term witch refers to a woman of spiritual knowledge. Witches were healers, herbalists, diviners, invokers, and those with mystical knowledge. The Old English meaning of the word craft included power, force, strength, cunning, knowledge, ability and skill, prescription and remedy. In the Middle Ages, European witches were also associated with the spinner goddesses and nature worship. As the church suppressed the old religions and replaced them with Christianity, the word witch became linked with causing harm to others by using occult powers. However, the persecution of women for witchcraft predates accusations from male physicians. The Bible commands, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live," Exodus 22:18. Women were burned for sorcery under imperial Roman law. In the late 1800s in England, the Royal Code of Alfred the Great decreed exile or death for witches and unchaste women. The connection between witches and sexual freedom reflected concerns about the worship of fertility goddesses and celebration of female reproduction. The early witch prosecutions aimed to suppress pagan practices among the poor and maintain control over women. Women who lived independently of men, widows and spinsters were targets. Their land and property could be taken from them if they were found guilty. It was feudal lords who carried out the early witch trials, and witch burnings were considered entertainment for aristocratic men. In the 1400s, witchcraft was declared the single greatest threat to Christian European civilization. In 1486, two Dominican inquisitors wrote a guide for witch hunting called Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches. The book claimed that where there are many women, there are many witches, and when a woman thinks alone, she thinks evil. The content reflected beliefs about women that were held by Christianity and medicine. Women are witches because, like Eve, they are feebler in both mind and body than men. More impressionable, credulous, and carnal, formed from a bent rib, they are defective, their slippery tongues cannot keep silent. Witch hunts spread like a plague across Europe and New England, continuing into the 18th century. Male physicians participated by providing medical expertise regarding whether a woman was a witch or not. This often involved carrying out invasive physical examinations of women's bodies. Estimates of how many people were killed vary from hundreds to thousands to millions. Men were also victims of the witch hunts. However, 85% of those killed were women, mostly poor, illiterate women and girls. In addition to those executed, many more were tortured, and the systemic persecution of witches generated fear and silence among women. It became dangerous to practice the healing arts. The witch hunts eliminated the majority of wise women and their wisdom, creating the opportunity for male physicians to take possession of medical practice and knowledge. Naturally, during the Middle Ages, midwives were at risk of being accused of witchcraft, and their practice came under scrutiny and suspicion. Childbirth was women's business and occurred in the home, away from the direct control of the church or state. It was well known that midwives used charms, spells, and incantations to assist women during labour. Midwives also had expertise in contraception and abortion and were believed to assist with infanticide. In an attempt to gain control over midwifery practice, the church and secular governments began to regulate them. For example, in England, midwives were required to be examined and admitted to practice by a bishop. The English Midwives' Oath of 1567 required midwives to pledge that they will not use any kind of sorcery or incantation in the time of the travail of any woman. Superstition surrounded particular elements of childbirth, such as the placenta, the umbilical cord, and the caul, a piece of amniotic membrane that sometimes covers the baby's head at birth. Regulations were published that forbade midwives from taking the placenta or caul in case they used them for witchcraft. Unsurprisingly, midwives made up a significant proportion of those killed during the witch hunts. Midwives and gossips. Despite losing control of medicine, women retained control of childbearing throughout the Middle Ages. Pregnancy, childbirth, and early mothering were considered normal life events that did not require medical practitioners. The legitimate scope of the wise woman was now limited to midwifery. In Old English, the word midwife literally means with woman. And the French version of the term, sage femme, means wise woman. Midwives relied on women requesting their services to make a living. In this way, they were chosen and sustained by the community. However, midwives also collaborated with the church and state in their work. They had a role in ascertaining paternity and providing legal witness to births. Attempts to license midwives occurred throughout the 1600s and 1700s with varying success. Gaining a license required the midwife to supply testimonials of her practice, pay a fee, and take an oath that she was of sober life and conversation. The Catholic Church gave midwives the right to baptize babies in utero to save the baby's soul if death was imminent. Midwives carried a device that could squirt holy water into a woman's vagina and onto the baby for this purpose. Midwives were also required to refer complicated births to male physicians. However, physicians had no training or experience in childbirth, and midwives could usually manage complications themselves. Therefore, physicians were rarely called to a birth. Childbirth remained a female-only event that sustained the collective culture of women via the ceremony of childbirth. Midwives attended births, providing oversight and administering the mother's caudle, a warmed drink consisting of ale or wine with sugar and spices. They were also required to identify and manage complications. Gossips, or persons invited to a birth for the subsequent purpose of baptism, provided the majority of the emotional and physical support for birthing women. The word gossip is a corruption of the word god, sib, or god, sibling. By the 1700s, gossip came to refer specifically to women who attended births in groups. Gossips were invited to a birth by the mother and were female relatives and close friends of the woman. They prepared the house for the birth and the arrival of the baby, cared for siblings, and provided practical and emotional support to the birthing woman. Gossips then visited the woman during her postnatal lying-in period to assist with the house chores and childcare. They also took the baby to be baptised because the mother was expected to remain indoors until her churching a month after birth. During churching, the woman attended church to be ritually purified and returned to society. In the villages and towns of Western Europe, there was male hostility to the ceremony of childbirth because it involved women gathering behind closed doors for significant amounts of time. There were concerns that they were neglecting their domestic duties and husbands, and suspicion about what was being discussed. Women also celebrated the birth of babies with alcohol and merriment during the postnatal period. In the late 16th century, several town governments in England attempted to regulate women's childbirth festivities, particularly during the lying-in period. Gossips were vilified and their role in the childbirth ceremony mocked. This response is illustrated by a satirical poem originally written in the 1600s entitled Tittle Tattle, or The Several Branches of Gossiping. The poem begins, "At childbed when the gossips meet, fine stories we are told, and if they get a cup too much, their tongues they cannot hold." The subsequent verses detail where gossips meet and how they behave, and the final verse reads, "Then gossips all a warning take, pray cease your tongue to rattle, go knit and sew and brew and bake, and leave off tittle-tattle." Science and instruments of rescue. The development of science contributed to the shift of power in childbirth. In the 16th century, male philosophers, including Francis Bacon and René Descartes, laid the foundations for modern-day approaches to scientific thinking and knowledge. From these foundations, a new mechanistic philosophy of the human body emerged. The universe was conceived as a huge machine governed by laws that could be understood through reason. The human body was also considered in terms of a machine, and childbirth was described as a mechanical process. Men were believed to be more mechanically minded than women, therefore better suited to understanding bodies. They began to study childbirth and developed a new understanding of it with accompanying language that enabled them to move into the female-controlled territory of childbirth and redefine it. The intervention of medical instruments offered a new response to complicated births. In the 13th century, the establishment of the Barber Surgeons Guild had secured the right of men to use surgical instruments to remove a dead baby to save the mother. Subsequent knowledge of anatomy and physiology enabled men to develop further technology. In the 1600s, a physician named Peter Chamberlain, a barber surgeon, invented forceps, which for the first time enabled the delivery of a live baby when labour became dangerous. The design of these instruments was kept secret by the family for generations, allowing them to charge a high price for rescuing mothers and babies. Once other barber surgeons worked out the design, they could also offer the intervention. Barber surgeons could now rescue both baby and mother and became known as man midwives or accoucheurs, specialising in complicated births. Women were banned from using these instruments, and man midwives became the predecessors of obstetricians. The use of technology in conjunction with science increased the status of male birth knowledge and helped to facilitate their eventual move into uncomplicated birth in the 1800s and into the present day. The social and cultural climate was rapidly changing during the rise of the man midwife, and these changes added to the erosion of traditional female practice. The professionalisation of many occupations gradually excluded women, and there was a general loss of female occupations such as weaving to men. Simultaneously, increasing industrialisation led to trades becoming separated from the home. Most women were unable to work in these trades because of their responsibilities within the home. Women who could work in factories no longer attended births as gossips due to their work patterns. Over time, the collective culture of women at birth became unsustainable. In France, the man midwife became popular with wealthy literate women because he represented proof of their social status. These women embraced the new scientific philosophy and its technology. In 1617, Louise Bourgeois, a French midwife, protested about this trend and complained about the coquettes who employed male midwives even for normal birth. In the rest of Europe, including England, men were still only employed to assist during complicated births. Male midwives capitalised on this by exaggerating the dangers of childbirth and denigrating the competence of female midwives. Wealthy women employed male midwives to wait in their home during birth in case they needed to manage a complication. Before the new scientific philosophy, women had built up a body of female knowledge about childbirth disseminated via their oral culture. This knowledge sat outside formal education from which they had historically been excluded. The shift towards book learning enabled men to publish medical texts that communicated their understanding of birth and further reinforced their authority in this area. Traditional female midwives faced difficulties articulating the nature of their knowledge. Their knowledge was less empirical, and they learned through apprenticeships and experience rather than books. When formal midwifery education was eventually introduced in the 18th century, it was based on the mechanistic understanding of birth created by men and led to the further suppression of traditional midwifery knowledge. Industrialisation and institutional maternity care. Medical knowledge about the human body continued to be constructed around sex-based stereotypes. Because women are capable of creating children, it was assumed that this was their primary biological role. Women were considered feeble of mind and victim to their reproductive urges. Rudolf Virchow, the father of modern pathology, stated that woman is a pair of ovaries with a human being attached, whereas a man is a human being furnished with a pair of testes. Female diseases and illnesses were explained as symptoms of women resisting or denying their biological destiny. Rational male medicine purported to be able to diagnose, treat, and control women's disordered bodies. In Europe and the United States, industrialization led to crowded living conditions and increased ill health and injury. Hospitals were established to provide large-scale medical care where patients could be managed by doctors and tended to by nurses. In the 18th century, lying-in hospitals were set up to provide free care to poor women and obstetric training for doctors and nurses. However, hospital conditions were crowded and unsanitary. Rates of childbed fever were high as doctors spread bacteria from ill and dead patients directly into birthing women's vaginas. The rates of maternal death due to infection would remain high until the discovery of antibiotics in the 20th century. Initially, the rates of injury and death for mothers and babies rose as hospital births increased. Despite this, over many decades, hospital birth became common for women of all classes. Hospitals and medicine offered pain relief and a sense of safety that filled the vacuum created by the collapse of the collective culture of women. Many first-wave feminists, 19th and early 20th century, considered the option of a medicalised hospital birth as a means of women gaining control over their body and reproductive life. They argued for the right to relieve the pain and suffering associated with pregnancy and birth. Nonetheless, despite a move towards hospital birth, home birth with the care of a midwife remained the cultural norm across Europe and beyond until the second half of the 20th century. During this time, midwives continued to provide care for the women in their communities as they had done for centuries. In the 20th century, as more women birthed in hospital, the medicalisation of childbirth began in earnest. Obstetricians and hospital-trained midwives became the primary carers for birthing women. Hospital practices were also influenced by the mass production concepts of industrialisation. Women's bodies were managed as though they were on a production line, with routine interventions aimed at making the birth process more effective and efficient. According to Claire Davison, the rise of obstetrics and its eventual dominance over midwifery in the Western world was achieved by the argument that those who cared for the female body could do so by viewing it as a machine to be supervised, controlled, and interfered with by technical means. Standard interventions included a pubic shave, enema, and bath, followed by rupturing the amniotic sac with an amni hook. Narcotics and sedation were then administered to induce a twilight sleep, and women were strapped to beds to avoid injuring themselves as they thrashed about partially conscious. As the baby's head appeared, medication, such as ergot, was injected to increase contractions, and forceps were often used to remove the baby from the unconscious woman. In many cases, women would wake from their twilight sleep with no memory of the birth and their baby already in the nursery. Babies would be brought to their mother for breastfeeding at specific times dictated by hospital routines. In Europe, between the late 1800s and early 1900s, medicine forged an alliance with nursing to bring midwifery under the legal and disciplinary control of medicine. Various strategic legislation resulted in midwifery becoming a branch of nursing rather than the separate profession it had always been. Whereas traditional midwifery evolved from the autonomous wise woman and her folk medicine, traditional nursing had emerged to support medical practice. Midwives were now educated and socialised as nurses first, then taught the knowledge and skills required to support medicalised birth. Moreover, midwives could not regulate their own profession. Instead, medicine and nursing had a dominant voice in their government. In parts of North America, midwifery was effectively outlawed and maternity care was provided only by obstetricians and nurses. World War II resulted in many young men being killed and subsequent need to replace them within the population. As in previous eras, war increased the interest and control of women's reproduction. Institutionalised antenatal care was implemented to improve the health of the population by surveillance and control of women's pregnancies. During this time, European midwives still provided antenatal and postnatal care in their communities. However, even more women chose to give birth in hospital, and this became the new cultural norm. The need to ensure a healthy population also led to medical advancements in the diagnosis and treatment of complications of childbearing such as preeclampsia and postpartum hemorrhage. Therefore, women with complicated pregnancies began to have access to more effective treatment and management in hospital settings. However, obstetric medicine continued to develop its knowledge of childbirth based on the 17th century concept of the body as a machine. The birth process was broken down into distinct stages that could be measured and plotted against timelines. This categorization allowed practitioners to measure progress through defined stages and create limits and boundaries around what was considered normal. It was believed that medicine and technology could make the woman's body more efficient at birthing. In the 1950s, an American obstetrician named Emanuel Friedman plotted onto a graph the cervical dilatation of 500 women having their first babies in a hospital. The study population included women who were sedated and had medication, Pitocin, to induce or speed up their labour, and 55% had forceps. In the 1970s, Friedman's graph was modified to guide practitioners working in a remote area of Rhodesia. The intention was to reduce the incidence of poor outcomes associated with obstructed labour in this particular setting, and an alert line and transfer to hospital line and an action augmentation line were added to Friedman's graph. The result was a partogram, a graph that plots cervical dilatation during labour across a timeline. By the 1980s, the partogram had been implemented into hospitals worldwide and is still used today to monitor and define normal progress of labour. Evidence-based medicine emerged in the 1970s but did not become firmly established in healthcare until the early 1990s. Obstetric resistance to implementing research findings into practice was well known among other specialities of medicine. Routine interventions such as fetal monitoring, breaking the amniotic sac and episiotomies were introduced as part of the general medicalisation of childbirth without any supporting research evidence. These interventions continue to be practiced with the onus on researchers to demonstrate it is safe and effective to stop carrying them out. However, even with good quality research evidence, obstetric practice remains culture-based rather than evidence-based. Many routine birth interventions are in direct opposition to the current research evidence and contradict modern knowledge about birth physiology. For example, the partogram remains firmly embedded in hospital practice, despite good research demonstrating it is ineffective at determining normal labour progress. This chapter has explored the key aspects of Herstory that form the warp our birth culture is woven through. These threads will be revisited throughout this book because current birth culture knowledge and practice reflects the Herstory of women and birth and women's status within society. The requirements of child ownership that emerged with patriarchy led to the subsequent need to control women and their reproduction. As medical knowledge developed, it was underpinned by earlier religious and cultural beliefs about women's bodies being dirty and malfunctioning versions of the superior male body. Eventually, the collective culture of women at birth was disrupted as social and cultural changes moved birth from the home to the hospital. These changes, taking place over centuries, enabled men to position themselves as the legitimate knowers and experts on birth. The legacy of our Herstory is rooted in centuries of appropriation and medicalization of women's bodies and birth. Understanding the yarns of Herstory allows us to understand what is happening today and to work with the warp to weave our future.